Tēnā koutou katoa, awhi o mai, a malo e lau malie. Nā mihi, ko Lonnie Hutchison taku ingoa, ko Ngāti Hamo, ko Ngāti Kuri, ko Ngāti Pākehā tuku hapu, ko Ngāi Tahu tuku iwi. I am an artist and a board member of Tautai Pacific's Trust. I am coming to you from the banks of the Ōpāwaho River in Otatahi, Christchurch. Te Waipanamu, Aotearoa New Zealand. I'd like to acknowledge my iwi, Ngāi Tahu, who are mana whenua of this takiwā. On behalf of Pacific Arts Trust, Tautai Pacific Arts Trust, I am honoured to welcome you all to the first event of the Talanoa Forum, Swimming Against the Tide, an extension of the critically acclaimed Paradise Camp by artist Yuki Kihara, presented at the New Zealand Pavilion and curated by Natalie King as part of the 59th Venice Biennale. Thank you all for joining us in this digital moana as we connect through time and space across the sea of our islands. Tautai Pacific Arts Trust was founded in 1986 by Whatuwheu, our Tautai patron, and his many passionate supporters who shared his vision to support and promote Pacific visual arts. Over the last 40 years, Tautai has grown to become one of Aotearoa's premier Pacific arts organisations with a multidisciplinary focus. Our purpose is to grow a rich ecology of tangata moana creative art practice and provide leadership, support, and unique opportunities for the tangata moana arts community. This year, we are proud to be a supporting partner for New Zealand at Venice. The Venice Biennale is the world's largest and most prestigious international contemporary arts exhibition, and Yuki Kihara is the first Pasifika, the first Asian, and the first whawhawhine artist to present Aotearoa New Zealand. As part of our support, we are excited to be facilitating the 3 online contributions to the Talanoa Forum, Swimming Against the Tide, directed by Yuki Kihara.
Welcome everyone. My name is Natalie King, and it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you to the first Talanoa webinar, Writers of Paradise Camp. I live and work in Naarm, Melbourne on Boonwurrung country, and I have been working very closely with Yuki Kihara as her curator and the editor of the Paradise Camp publication. Thank you to everyone for joining us across continents, waterways and time zones as we discuss some of the urgent issues emanating from Yuki Kihara's Paradise Camp publication. Some of the issues that we will be looking at today are intersectionality, environmental crises, and colonisation. Today, I am joined by an illustrious lineup of writers who have all contributed luminous essays to our publication, Paradise Camp, published by Thames Hudson. The book has been published on the occasion of Yuki Kihara's presentation for Aotearoa New Zealand at the 59th Venice Biennale. Our publication was conceived and commissioned during harsh lockdown and during the preparatory phase of the Venice Biennale. We worked collaboratively and diligently to achieve a standalone book that is a hybrid of an exhibition catalogue and a monograph, because we wanted to reveal Yuki's interdisciplinary and expansive practice. We also wanted to publish a book that had longevity beyond the 7-month exhibition cycle and contextualise Paradise Camp with a series of previous works, poems, and Yuki's archive, which exposes her creative methodology. There is also a bristling clarion call to decolonise our predilections by New York activist and artist Coco Fusco. The book is 160 pages, full colour, and available in all good bookstores with significant Northern Hemisphere distribution. I'm told that the publication has sold out twice at La Biennale bookstore, and we are thrilled that it has had so much impact. I am immensely grateful to all of the writers for their contribution and their very thoughtful reflections on Yuki's practice. And thank you, all of you, for joining us for the Talanoa. Now I would like to welcome Dan to introduce himself and read Whawhawhine poem number 12. Thank you, Dan.
Hello, my name is Dan Taulapapa McMullin. I'm a poet and a painter from Samoa Society, or American Samoa. The poem, and I would like to thank Yuki for inviting me to this project, this beautiful project, and to Natalie for selecting some poems from my book, Coconut Milk, 2013 book, Coconut Milk. This is called Whawhawhine poem number 12. I was at home in Aotearoa, Samoa, about to visit a village in Manua. A friend, Kay, suggested I stay with his mother, FAWMM, which I did. FAWMM in the afternoon liked to sit on a nicely woven mat with her small granddaughter in her family meeting house, a lovely round little building without walls, just round white pillars. FAWMM was a local expert in the weaving of itonga, or Samoan fine mats. Her practice was walking around the village, advising, encouraging young women in their weaving. Her inner forearms were scarred with diagonal lines from the sharp pandanus leaves she gathered. Every sunset during my stay, FAWMM and her little granddaughter and I took a stroll around the village, talking with neighbors. Some of the women neighbors had a very friendly relationship with her. Some pointedly ignored her with a humph, turning in their gardening sivanofo. And some of the men seemed to have intimate friendships with her. The language of their bodies, suddenly youthful again, in a walking dance of greeting. She in front, his brown hands gently on her brown shoulders. When I returned to Apia, a friend M asked who I stayed with, and I said our friend Kay's mother, FAWMM, to which M remarked, his mother. Kay's parents died when he was young. He was brought up by Whawhawhine. FAWMM wanted me to learn how to weave fine mats, a woman's art, and I said I'd come back. She said, don't wait. Our time is short. And a year or two later, she took the last journey. I didn't return in time to revisit my elder or learn the perfection of her art, but her walk is my walk too. And that was FAWMM. I remember in the evening, she would, when she had a gentleman call her, she was 80. She was very careful with the makeup. But I guess the lesson is, if you want to weave fine mats, expect to be scarred.
Thank you, Dan, for commencing our webinar. It was so evocative and poetic and really vivid. Ngahuia, if I could turn to you to please introduce yourself, and perhaps you could share with us your foundational lecture that you gave at the Gauguin Symposium that in fact inspired Yuki's project Paradise Camp for the Venice Biennale. Thank you.
Kia ora everyone. Hello again. First of all, I want to say that I feel so honoured and affirmed that Yuki was moved by something I wrote 30 years ago and that I thought was likely to disappear. So being part of this project, as a former academic, currently Emeritus Professor, ritual specialist in my village, is an extraordinary privilege and a massive thrill. And I don't know how to thank you enough, Yuki, seeing you at the Otara market and about 3 years ago. And you told me, and I just screamed. I mean, it was like, my God, it's taken nearly 30 years to surface again. And I thank you for that. Because at the time of its writing, when I presented it to this incredibly middle-class, waspish gathering of art historians and academics, I expected their reaction. However, one person there was incredibly supportive, and that was Rick Britell, so I must acknowledge him. Anyway, I was asked in your letter, Natalie, in your email, if I would talk about the people in my life who inspired me to write what I wrote, which was, for years, I have looked at those faces and I have wondered about them. Kuwaira rātou ake, who were they? Because I grew up in a relatively traditional community, albeit invaded by tourists, here in Rotorua in the thermal region of Aotearoa, New Zealand. My family are guides, weavers, dancers, singers, storytellers. My grandmother was a significant guide and performer, but she was also a remarkable weaver, and in her day, a celebrated beauty. And her pictures are in the book, and there are hundreds of postcards of her still around. And so, and after her came my aunts and my mother's generation, and then, of course, my own cousins and I and others participated in this whole village, I might say tradition, of presenting ourselves, of being photographed, of being painted. And so when I looked at Gauguin, I saw some of my relatives with whom I'd grown up, and they were so familiar. Around the village is Ohenemutu. We had a couple of outstanding celebrities in their own space. One was Princess, who had a very straight male name. And she was always extraordinary and very popular. She assisted at a little souvenir shop on the marae, and she did lots of work and had the most impeccable fingernails. And I'm talking about the 1950s and 60s. And as well as Princess, there was Reggie, who went off to Sydney and danced with Carmen. I was born in the 1940s, so my recollection is of the scene from the 50s, 60s, 70s. It's not now. I must say that, because I think now is very different. And Reggie was remarkable too, because unlike Princess, who was a diminutive 5'6", Reggie was well over 6 feet and had a most prominent Adam's apple. So she would wear the most elegant scarves and drift around the village and flirt with everybody. Another relative was T, and T wasn't quite brave enough to wear frocks, but always made sure that what he did wear was impeccably stylish, and the hair gave it away. It really did. So these are the people that were around me. And then in the mid-60s, in 66, I ended up at Auckland University and found myself looking for people like me, because I knew way back then that I was a queer girl. And I found them, and they were fabulous, and they were all Māori. And so, and their names were names like Natasha, Gypsy, Sherelle, Belinda Lee, glamorous names, exciting names, Ava Gardner. And running along behind them were a group of butchers, butch lesbians, with names like Flea and Sandos and Bobby and Rufus. And they all wore suits and were quite chunky and looked remarkable. And here was this girl from the village, me, kind of caught up in this and completely fascinated. So looking at the work that Gauguin produced, I saw those faces. I saw that arrogance. I saw that absolutely sublime confidence and poise and a kind of natural dignity. A lot of it was how they sat, how he captured the line of a neck, how he shows in the marketplace scene these incredibly straight backs and this slightly cynical manner. And I recognized my whānau, my family, not the heterosexuals, not the straight aunties. I saw my whawhawhine mahu, whakawahine cousins and aunties. And that's what motivated the paper, which I did in 92, which meant, of course, that I had to look at Noa Noa and other work that Gauguin did himself, as well as the, and I hate to say it, but the 18th and 19th century record of what Northern Hemisphere people had seen, had commented on, had noticed about people like us. And so that's what turned into the paper. Before I finish though, I'd just like to say that one of the more exciting developments in the last 30 years, because when I was writing that stuff, I was pretty much on my own. And that may sound conceited, but there were very few Indigenous, Pasifika, queer writers who put it out there the way it really is. And if we tried to, we weren't published. You know, I mean, lots of us were writing and making stuff, but very few of us managed to share it any more broadly than our own friendship circles and families. And while this is going on, like the last 150 years, Palangi, Pākehā, Northern Hemisphere anthropologists, psychologists, people that worked in their own heads, took control of our lives, of our representation, of our stories, and they're continuing to do that. And so for me, Paradise Camp, again, is turning that around. And what has absolutely enthralled me in the 3 decades since Paradise, or since He Tangi Mō Hapuani, is that so much has been written, painted, sculpted, acknowledged and celebrated by us since then. And that's the second, I guess, the epilogue of the essay I did in 92. We talk about intersectionality, but again, that's a particularly vulgar and categorizing academic word. It's like talking about va and claiming it with our language on our terms. I'd like to see us do the same for those kinds of concepts too. And this Talanoa and what we'll be discussing in Europe is, I think, a beginning and a particularly rich one. So again, I would like to mihi to Yuki, to acknowledge Yuki and your extraordinary work, and how with the exhibition, with Natalie and Ioana, with the team that put together this, and by the team I also mean those glamorous models and their outrageous beauty and absolute courage. Like with them, you've made something really, really special. And it's mō ngā uri whakatupu, speaking in Māori, you've made something for the kids that are coming up, the ones in our future. Because we live in an incredibly turbulent and difficult time, you know, and this is a way forward, and I'm just so proud to be part of it. Nō reira, tēnā no tātou katoa, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngahuia, for your very personal and touching reflections, and how more recently this script has been defiantly flipped by artists like Yuki. Yuki, I wonder if you could pick up on Ngahuia's comment on the va and the way that you've called your archive a varchive and integrated and collected colonial photographs that you have interrogated creatively.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much, Ngahuia, for your generous words. And then thank you to all our writers on the screen for your contribution to this online Talanoa. There is a section in the Paradise Camp exhibition, which is called the Varchive, where the Varchive essentially underpins the argument to why I created a fictitious world called Paradise Camp. Now, the reason why I called the archive section the Varchive is because I believe that what I did in the archive section, which draws together not just museum archives that are statically sort of and chronologically arranged in a colonial format. I've also, in addition, included other forms of archive, including the trophy that was generously awarded by the Samoa Fafini Association for my contribution to the community, and alongside tourism campaigns of Samoa, stamps, so on and so forth, drawing from a variety of different sources, to establish the argument. And then now where the word va comes into the archive is that Albert Wendt talks about the concept of va as a space in between, and it's a space of negotiation between these two distinctive binary spaces. And then so by having all these, a variety of materials that I've sourced, the audience is able to look at the archive that are drawn from a variety of different places and then draw their own conclusion, hopefully through this, from the view of the VA, that I'm talking about in the presentation of the archive or the archive. And it's really interesting listening to Ngahuia talk about how when she looked at some of the paintings of Paul Gauguin, reminded her of her Māori whānau, could be actually be really valid. And then I'll tell you why. Because what I found in my own research is that Gauguin have reappropriated photographs of people and places in Samoa that were taken by New Zealand colonial photographer Thomas Andrew, who set up his studio in Samoa in the early 20th century. And then now, by the time Gauguin arrives in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 1895, photographs of Maoris and Pacific people were already in active circulation in the tourism market across the country. And then I believe that, we also find, a signature of Paul Gauguin, at the Auckland Art Gallery visitors book, that gives evidence to, his time in Tamaki Makaurau. And I believe that he may have actually collected a bunch of postcards of both Samoans and Maoris and others, and then took it back with him to Tahiti, and then used them as inspiration for his paintings, which he gave Tahitian and Marquesan titles. Now, in my archive, I'm specifically addressing the Samoan connection, directly and indirectly, to Paul Gauguin paintings. I show a very short examples of an expansive evidence that I found. But by just listening to Ngahuia, say that, these paintings of Paul Gauguin reminded her of her Māori whānau, given that your whānau, Ngahuia, were actively participating, in being photographed, and then reproduced as postcards. They were mass produced. I believe that, Gauguin may have actually picked up those postcards of your relatives and took it back with him, and then may have reappropriated them as well, because of the active circulation of those photographs across the country in Aotearoa at the time, in 1895. So that's my hypothesis. But I think it will, I'm interested now in actually going back to your chapter and looking at the photographs of your relatives that are published in the chapter, and actually compare them to all the Gauguin paintings that he painted during his time in French Polynesia. And I'm sure that we can find some resemblance in the faces and the composition. Because, he cut and pasted many of, figures in different places. I mean, he wasn't, just inspired by Oceania. He was inspired by, those in Asia and Africa as well. But, that's just what came to mind when you spoke about your Māori whānau. So, yeah, but if anybody wants to know more, then please get the book. Anyway, I'll now pass it over to Natalie. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Yuki. One of the reasons why we wanted to lure you into writing a chapter in your own publication about your archive was to really show the breadth of your research and your methodology, and the kinds of images that you collect, collate, review, and have a fully annotated archive chapter to really reveal to readers your thinking and your process, because often when you see an exhibition, you don't fully understand as an audience the artist's process of assembling images and the real depth of archival research that you undertake. But if we could now turn to Patrick. Patrick, if you could please introduce yourself, and we'd also like to acknowledge your exceptional contribution and the fact that you're also curating the Taiwan Pavilion in the Venice Biennale. So in fact, Paradise Camp has coexisted alongside your contribution. If you could please introduce yourself and then discuss your essay where you write very eloquently about Yuki's vast wallpaper oceanscape and an islet that you found particularly fascinating. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm Patrick Flores. I teach art history at the University of the Philippines in Manila. I also curate the university museum called the Vargas Museum. I'd like to thank Natalie and Yuki for this gracious invitation for me to be part of the publication and to be in the same year in Venice with me curating the Taiwan Pavilion. I think among the writers here, I'm the least immersed in the context. So I approach this participation as some kind of an exploration, a way for me to be part of a conversation around the Pacific and with maybe Australasia as a link from Southeast Asia and the Philippines. So for me, this was a very instructive moment as an art historian and also as a curator. I think earlier during the preparation of the pavilions, Natalie, Yuki, and I were talking about some kind of collaboration with the Taiwan Pavilion, but something happened with the Taiwan Pavilion, which is quite a long, sad story, but which is, I think, deserves another seminar. I really didn't have, Natalie, extensive research on the Nu'uteli islet, but it caught my attention. Yuki's practice has so many moving parts and so many layers, and I wanted to dwell on a particular trope, a particular image, and particular material, and I saw that in the wallpaper of the islet. So first, I made some notes here. So first, I was drawn to the wallpaper as medium. For me, it's an important, an interesting aspect. The materiality of the wallpaper, the medium that is the medium of the exotic and also of the Pacific. And I was interested in how the medium circulates commercially, but also domestically. So that was one interest I had in the wallpaper. I was also interested in the wallpaper as a curatorial device. So it references an islet with fraught history. At the same time, it creates a space, which is the pavilion. So I was, interested in the double coding of the wallpaper as a reference, historical reference of the exotic and the Pacific, and at the same time a way to create a new space to be inhabited in Venice. So I'm interested in that kind of convergence of the curatorial and maybe the research and the art historical. Secondly, I was interested in the trope of the island. It's interested in how water and land come together. I think this is important in doing an ecological art history today. And it's not a continent. That's also important. I'm interested in an archipelagic sensibility. The Philippines is an archipelago, so maybe that's why I was drawn to this trope of the island. And finally, I was interested in the history of the island itself. More recently, the calamity that visited the island in 2009. I think there was a tsunami that ravaged it. The Philippines is no stranger to this regular visitation of calamities, and also, of course, the fact that it used to be a leper colony. So that is the other layer that is interesting. So finally, I was interested to speak to Yuki's problematization and also reconstruction of subjectivity. And in that process, I wanted place and body to intertwine. So that was a theoretical aspiration for me to make or let place and body intertwine. That's why the title is Skin Colony. So I wanted those two to come together and maybe to move beyond binarism, no? That seems to shape much of post-colonial art history. So I was interested in the leper colony as my access to exclusion, displacement, and also the transformation of the body via the camp, no? Which is the colony. I also was interested in this convergence of the camp, which is the leper colony as well, and also camp maybe in the register of queer epistemology. No? So skin colony for me is an equivalent gesture, I hope, to the proposition of paradise camp. Yeah. That's it, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Patrick. There's a lot that we can unpack there. Ioana, if we could turn to you, our illustrious comrade, confidant, part of the curatorial team. You know, you've had a really invaluable role, and I am, immensely in debt for all your hard work. If you could please introduce yourself and also discuss the chronology on Yuki that you compiled in images and words, and some of the discoveries and kind of revelations that you assembled in a very detailed chronology that we have included in the publication.
Sure. Thanks for that warm intro. Talofa lava. Hi, everyone. My name is Ioana. I'm an independent curator and arts writer. I'm Samoan from the villages of Valeula and Ngaupaara on my mum's side, English on my dad's side. Was born and raised in Porirua, where I'm still based today. For the last 3 years, I've had the enormous pleasure of being the assistant curator Pasifika for Paradise Camp, and have been really excited to be part of the publication journey as well. So my contribution to the publication is a chronology, and the chronology replaces what would be a traditional artistic CV in a publication. And the purpose of the chronology was to give an overview not only of how of where Yuki's works have travelled and been presented, but also to give an insight into the moments that have inspired and informed her works. So thank you, Yuki, for being so generous and sharing that information with me and with our readers as well. Some really beautiful personal photographs in the chronology, I think. There are quite a few different threads that come through the chronology that are of interest to me as a bit of a revelation, as you put it, Natalie. One of my favourite parts of the chronology is the focus on Yuki's early fashion training. So Yuki studied fashion at Wellington Polytechnic, and included in the chronology is an image of Yuki's graduate collection, as well as a work called Graffiti Dress Bombacific, which was acquired by Te Papa when Yuki was still a student, as well as some images of photo spreads that Yuki directed. And I find that early history really fascinating, because I think it foreshadows and foregrounds Yuki's ongoing interest in the body and in dress within her later works, which the body being something that Patrick has just picked up on earlier. One of the other things that comes through in the chronology really is Yuki's dedicated interest in museum collections. So the chronology traces different collections that Yuki has visited, from Frankfurt through to Samoa, and you can see how these collections have really informed work. So you can see how a visit to the Linden Museum, for example, surfaced photographs that then influenced Yuki's series Do Papalangi. And you can see how visiting the textile collections at the Samoa Museum with Sylvia Hanipale was part of the research process for creating the siapo in Paradise Camp. And I think for me, the main thing that comes across about all those museum collections is just how global that circuit of moana material and visual histories really is. I think Yuki was saying earlier how Gauguin's visit coincided with this national circuit of ethnographic photography. And I think those museum collections reveal how colonisation really meant that that imagery was circulating right across the world, and how Pacific histories have always kind of been quite international. And then the last thing I just want to mention is that the chronology offers kind of like this long arc of the research and development of a body of work, which is quite nice, I think, because it's not often that you get to see that behind the scenes insight into how a work was developed. So for example, Salome is a figure that recurs through many of Yuki's bodies of work, and the chronology kind of traces that research right back to this childhood connection with Tuia Tua Tupua Tamasese and his writings, and then to a Te Papa visit while at fashion school and finding Thomas Andrews' photographs there. And then we can see early iterations of Salome as well. So you see Yuki performing as Salome in a work called Tawalunga, The Last Dance, as part of the 4th Asia Pacific Triennial with the Pasifika Divas. And there are little behind the scenes snapshots of the kind of social context of Yuki's works as well. So I think there's a photo with you, Ngahuia, with Lea Wha Wilson, a curator, and Yuki at the 4th APT. So it's kind of cute as well to kind of notice these social contexts that all of this research and development is happening within. So yeah, I could go on forever. I think it's a really nice way of capturing all the different threads that interweave in Yuki's practice.
Thanks, Ioana. And to start our Talanoa, I was rereading all the essays today, and I was struck how Yuki's archive, Dan's chapter, Ngahuia's essay are all written in the first person with very personal reflections. And often academic writing is in the third person, it's detached, it's remote, and you all write with such, with your positionality very much declared and very much embedded in your writing. I wonder if you can each reflect on the role of oneself and one's positionality in your writing and thinking. Dan, would you like to start?
I think it's a theme often of Indigenous writing. I went to CalArts in California when I was 19 in the late 70s, and the invisibility of a community in academia, in the art world, or the lack of a community was it was devastating. And so I think that's true for many Indigenous people in colonial environments, which is the environment we're in now. I think when Indigenous people often write, they often use the first person, but meaning really the community. And I think it's a different way of positioning oneself than a colonizer using the first person, because it helps to establish who we are as a community. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Ngahuia, would you like to share some reflections?
Okay. I'd like to support what Dan has said. Thank you. Absolutely, I'm right there too. But in the epilogue, I actually write as a straight academic. I mean, as a conservative academic. You'll note there are two very different tones. The first paper done 30 years ago was very much a personal challenge, which came out of my village, out of my tribal environment, out of my visual history. The second one, the epilogue, which Natalie and Yuki so kindly prompted me to contribute, is much more referenced and in a way much more focused on the work that we have done for ourselves, showing the world we have our own voices now. And so I think that as Indigenous scholars, we are constantly required or prompted to walk both worlds and to do this with excellence and with focus. And all of us on screen know about that, and we've all achieved it. But I think for matters of the heart, the personal voice comes through. And that first paper was very much a matter of my heart. It was about seeing people who lived in Tahiti over 100 years ago representing, or rather shown with the faces of my family. That was the grab, and that's what I took and explored. So kia ora, thank you. Enough from me.
Thank you, Dan and Ngahuia, for your contribution to that answer. For me, I was actually very frightened about writing in the first person, especially when it came to the interview between myself and Natalie, because it was really about like, what part of myself do I want to share with the world? And then so, given that, Paradise Camp is highly personal for me, there are aspects of myself that I don't reveal to anybody, that I've actually written it in the book with the hopes that nobody would read it. But too late now. It's really happening. Because like I've never discussed about my love life, with the men that I've been with. I've never, discussed, the relationship with my family. I never discussed the research aspect of my practice before that Natalie took fascination and decided that to turn it into a chapter. So there's a lot of firsts in this publication that really took me out of my comfort zone. And to be honest, like I don't really want to work on another book. Because like after finding out what you all writers do in putting a publication together, I think I just rather just stick to being an artist. I'm very comfortable with that. But it was lots of firsts for me. The production of Paradise Camp was a first, and the book was a first. There's lots of firsts, and I have to say this project really challenged me to my core. And then but I mean, I think all of this, hard work, has paid off because of the amount of the criticality that surrounds Paradise Camp, has been amazing. The amount of feedback that I've been getting, the media, write-ups and things like that, and the amount of inquiries that I've been receiving about Paradise Camp, both the exhibition and the publication, and it's sold out at the Arsenale and the Giardini bookstores. So it's been a roller coaster ride, and it's still happening. So yeah, I'm very grateful for this experience. But yeah, I hope my family don't read my chapter with Natalie.
Thank you, Yuki. I'm really happy to open the floor for more of an exchange amongst us. Patrick, do you have any thoughts or questions?
No, maybe just to speak to the question of the personal, Natalie, although I didn't speak from that point of view, I tried to invite the reader to the situation in the pavilion through the wallpaper. So I think this is also an interesting strategy, to develop some kind of phenomenology in the writing, that the reader is ushered into like a site-specific condition, and that's what I was, and I was trying to do that through the essay, and perhaps the theorization that arises from the text is shaped by curatorial thinking. So I've been developing this as well in my work, because I do both. I curate and I write art history, and I benefit a lot from my curatorial practice in changing or inflecting the register of the art historical writing. So I think in a way that's where the personal comes in, through the phenomenology and also the curatorial sensibility.
I have a question for Dan. Dan, I believe that you published a book that you've been working on over the pandemic, that was published by the Honolulu Triennial on Polynesian queer histories. Are you able to talk a little bit about that?
The book, and it also relates to the research for the essay I wrote for Paradise Camp, which is called Whawhine Thirstery, is part of, I don't really know where it originated. It's going into the novel that I'm working on now. But it's called The Healer's Wound. And it came out of an essay I wrote about 10 years ago called Jesus, I think it was called Jesus Talanoa and Napanua. And it might have started with, I'd just like to show you. And then speaking of also of using the first person in this book, I didn't write anything in the book. It's all text from the archive, and mostly text from before 50 years ago, because I wanted to show kind of the background that myself and Ngahuia and yourself, Yuki, that we came into. And so originally I was looking at trying to find a connection between Mahu, kind of our Hawaiian side, and the Whawhine culture. That was kind of a vague thought going into the work. And I couldn't actually find a direct relationship. In fact, I think maybe the word Mahu is originally Hawaiian and then became applied also to, but I believe the word Whawhine is cognate also with the similar words in Ho'ovahine, in Hawaii and similar words in Aotearoa and elsewhere. So that was an interesting history to sort of delve into. I had to sort of improve my language skills, but I wanted to show two images. One was an image that I was originally sent by a friend, Rosanna Raymond, the Samoan artist, who at that time, this was like 15, 20 years ago, was studying in the British Museum. And she came across this photograph and she sent it to me and she said, "Isn't he beautiful?" And that's all, that's all she said. "Isn't he beautiful?" I know what we're talking about. And so I always kind of thought about this photograph. And when I began writing about our culture, I focused on this photograph as an example of how we were unnamed. It's a photograph by John Davis, who was a photographer in Apia in Samoa, whose studio actually burnt down at one time late in his career. But he took many photographs of this person, more than any other person that he photographed. And it made me wonder if maybe he had a relationship with this person, or if maybe he really admired this person. I think maybe it was just someone he admired. And I identified this person as Fa'afafine, who's unnamed, anonymous, because of the hairstyle. The men in Samoa wore a top knot, up like that, as a sign of peace when they walked in the village. And then when they went to war, they let their hair down. So men had long hair and women had short hair. But when the Christians came, they didn't like that. So they made a law that women had to grow their hair long and men had to cut their hair short. And this is kind of chronicled in the missionary chronicles of Samoa, that if you went to a pagan village, you would see men with long hair and women with short hair. If you went to a Christian village, women had long hair. So this idea of a Polynesian woman with long hair is actually a Christian idea. And now this photograph was taken long after Christianity had established itself in Samoa. And this person has this long hair that's done up in a bun, and they also have a forelock, which is this kind of a sign of virginity in the old culture. So I think they were just taking the piss out, as they say. And another photograph, some other photographs I came across that I didn't identify as Fa'afafine originally, like this photograph of a ship, that I realized there was a person in the water in front of the ship. And I realized that person was Fa'afafine. Again, anonymous, and I'm not named as Fa'afafine. And then I realized that there was another figure, this boy at the front of the ship. And then I realized that person was Fa'afafine. So I began looking into the archive, and I realized also there is so little information in the archive. And Pratt, Reverend Pratt, who translated with many Samoan orators, translated the Bible into Samoan, directly, supposedly, from the Hebrew and Greek. Pratt wrote the first Samoan English dictionary. And in the first Samoan English dictionary, he did not include the word Fa'afafine. But in the second, and this was in the 1860s, but in the second Samoan dictionary, the 1870s, he did. And also the word Fa'atane, which means the way of a man, a woman who lives the way of a man. And it's similar to the Māori word Whakatane. And the word Tautane, which is men who love men. And he said, and he quoted from Shakespeare in his introduction to the Second Samoan Dictionary, and he said that, it was a quote from a play of Shakespeare's where he said that there are some words that we use so that we know what to hate. And that is why Pratt introduced the words Fa'afafine and so on into the Samoan Dictionary, so that Now, interestingly, he did not include the word Fa'afine in the Samoan Bible. And for me, and I noticed in Yuki's exhibition, there's a quote from an essay I wrote that says, men may not sleep with men, but men may sleep with Fa'afine. And that was sort of my surmise. And I would like to think that the orators and the chiefs who translated the Bible for Pratt into Samoan did not put the word Fa'afine in there out of respect for Fa'afine, because Fa'afine is such an important part of Samoan culture and have been since the very beginning. I also quote in my book, and it's also in the essay, a story, a creation story from Samoa that was collected in Manoa, that was recorded from Talanoa and Fofo, and was collected. And in that story, in the original creation story of Samoa, there are two men who were the first created human beings. One of them died, they were fishermen, having been poisoned by a poisoned fish. And Tuli, who was the child of Talanoa, god of the skies, which is a bird, golden plover, complained to Talanoa that one of them died. Talanoa sent Ngaitosi, who was kind of the maker deity of Samoa, and Ngaitosi turned this man into a woman. And those two people were the ancestors of the human race in Samoan culture. And so from the very beginning, Fa'afine have been central to our conception of who we are as Samoans. And then just one last image I included in the book was also part of primary research. I was looking at the paintings of John Lafarge, the American painter. He was in Samoa the year before Gauguin went to Tahiti. And John Lafarge went with Henry Adams, who was the grandson of American presidents and great-grandson of American presidents. He was very wealthy, really, and he was considered the first tourist in the South Pacific, Henry Adams. And John Lafarge was his friend, this painter, and they chartered a ship and they went to Tahiti, they went to Samoa, and it was all over the newspapers, all over the world. And so Gauguin would have known about this journey of Lafarge and Henry Adams to Samoa before he went to Tahiti, and it may have influenced him to go to Tahiti. I don't know. But among the paintings that John Lafarge did in Samoa, which were very beautiful paintings, was a watercolor sketch called Chiefs and Chiefesses on their Way to a Congress. And I looked at the painting. It doesn't, again, no names, like colonial images always have. They don't, it's very rare, unless it's a king or a queen. It's very rare that they name the person in the photograph. Whether or not they're friends of the people making the images, which is really sad. But in this painting, well, you see the figures. You know, none of the figures have breasts. So the chiefesses seem to have been born with male bodies. So it's not identified as Fa'afine. I mean, the text I put in myself. The text is not in the original painting. But to me, this painter, John Lafarge, who incidentally spent his last day painting a young man, and Henry Adams was on the ship and had to send a boat back to him and say, come on, we're going, you know. And there was no flight to catch. There was no ship to catch. You know, it was either get on the ship or you're stuck in Samoa, you know, for whatever. But I suppose he could have caught a whaling ship back. But he was painting this beautiful young man, and that was the last painting he did in Samoa, John Lafarge, who was married and had a family. But I think he knew Fa'afine intimately. And this is the first Western painting of Fa'afine. And I don't know if that photograph is the first photograph of Fa'afine, but it's the earliest one that I can find. So I think it may be the earliest photograph of Fa'afine. And then the rest of the book is other images from, because our history is so decimated. In the beginning by the missionaries, and then finally by ourselves. We ourselves, Polynesians, in embracing Christianity, rejected our own culture. And all my life growing up someone, especially coming from an evangelical sort of right-wing Christian family, I've always heard the word custom sort of with a sneer, culture with a sneer, sort of cultural cringe. And so it was eventually we ourselves who. And then in time, people like Ngahuia, who we hold up as the person who really broke the ground for the queer community in Aotearoa, but also for the queer community in a global sense for all Polynesians. And yourself, Yuki, we hold up people like this as people who enter that colonial space that invaded us, that caused so much death, up to 90% in many island nations. It caused so much elision and destruction of our artworks and also of our poetry. So when I put together my book, The Healer's Wound, I made it a book. I call it a queer thirstery of Polynesian, because there's so little information. There was the little bit that Ngahuia in her research on Māori culture found. Interestingly, I should stop talking, but interestingly, the most I found was in Hawaii about queer cultures. And that was through a mistranslation of the word aikane, because the translation had changed to mean a friendly relationship between men. But originally it meant a sort of protege relationship between an older chief and a younger chief, which was often sexual. That's what White Cook called Kamehameha a clown, because he had all these young male lovers around him. And so the word aikane was then mistranslated to mean platonic relationship. And because of that, many aikane stories survived because of this mistranslation. And because of that, I think, because the word Fa'afine was not included in the Samoan Bible, I think that made it possible for Fa'afine to survive in Samoan church culture, knowing, of course, that the Samoan church was the first Polynesian church to separate from the English church and become independent. But it enabled Fa'afine to continue to go to church as women and to participate in society publicly as women. But it's a very complicated history.
Thank you very much for that, Dan, because in my consultation with the Fa'afine community about how they wanted to be represented, one of the main things that came through in my consultation is that they wanted to be presented as devout Christian people. Hence, we have a photograph of Lesina and Tanya To'omalatai, in the upcycled version of the one of my photographs that I have in Paradise Camp that I hope everybody will come and see. But it is a, it might be seen as a paradox as such, but, in Samoan culture, it's, nobody blinks an eyelid, when you see a Fa'afine, Ilapuletasi in a church, in church activities. And it's really interesting because, you know, they wanted me to kind of tone down the drag part more and it's sort of elevate the church part more. But because I have artistic license, I kind of wanted to show both, you know, which is how I see it, you know what I mean? And, you know, I wasn't there to kind of like present a campaign, you know, I was there to present a vision. So, so we'll see when Paradise Camp tours Samoa in 2024 and what they say about it. Natalie, back to you.
I just thought Ngahuia might have an extension to some of Dan's thoughts about the decimation of culture and the role of representation and misrepresentation, and how you know, what are the ways that one can combat that, maybe through words.
Well, first of all, Dan, thank you for your commentary, and Natalie, thanks for inviting me back in. The one word that has been, I think, grandly appropriated is takatapui, and that was a word a colleague and I, a gay colleague named Lee Smith, who alas has since left us, he and I came across around the same time, working on early 19th century manuscripts written by Māori. And of course, the story, which you may know, is of a famous love affair. But what happened in the beginning of the story is that the lover, the main male person, whose name was Tūtānekai, had an intimate friend of the same sex, whose name was Tiki. And all through this original manuscript written, and I will say it by my 5 generations back grandfather, Te Rangi Kāheke, in his account, which was collected by George Grey, the Governor General, in 1848, in Te Rangi Kāheke's account, it is very obvious that these two men were engaging in sexual relations, if you read the original Māori. So that is out there. It exists. Similarly, there are carved feather boxes, beautiful examples of 18th century so-called Cook era or pre-Cook era carved images, which are flamboyantly homoerotic. There's one very famous example I found in the British Museum where there are 8 men having sex with each other. And so the evidence is there in our art. It's there in our traditional chant. We have got examples in the Māori world of very, very old oral histories, like particular chants. And in the original versions, written down by people like my ancestor, the lovers are not male and female together. And in the more recent iterations, suddenly they are. So we've been very fortunate, I think, though, despite what other decolonizing academics may claim, we have actually been very fortunate in that we do have, as an Indigenous population, an incomparably rich resource of information which our own ancestors recorded. Because Māori were literate in the 1820s, and although they had been trained and taught by white missionaries, even in those relationships, you had sex happening at a really high level. And those particular scandals are on record in the Mitchell Library and in the early criminal cases of New South Wales. So these same boys that were having it off with missionaries were the ones that recorded a lot of the information. And we're, you know, I'm not saying that we're completely okay. There was masses of information lost. And certainly there was a real active destruction in the land wars and in the Christian invasions that followed those wars. But somehow we also kept something else happening with particular families and with particular archivists. And I mean that in the traditional Māori sense, who kept the oral histories going. And if they became literate, who recorded them, who wrote them down. And there are families still with us whose descendants had sustained those records, and in many cases have kept the original manuscripts. So we've been quite lucky in that way. As I said, despite what the decolonising sector claims, but that's another conversation for another time. Kia ora.
I wonder if we could...
It's really...
Sorry, go ahead, Yuki.
Yeah, sorry, Natalie. It's interesting when, you know, Ngahuia says about, you know, these decolonizing movements that are happening across the indigenous world, because most of the folks that are leading this this vision of decolonization has often mostly been heteronormative. It you know, it eliminates, you know, the fa'afafine, the katakatapui, you know, the aikane, you know, especially by indigenous peoples whose vision of decolonization is so heteronormative that they actually think that they can leave us behind. Well, not anymore. Not anymore. Paradise Camp is at Venice Biennale now. You know, we're doing this, you know, online Talanoa now. You know, there is no way they can brush it off. But I absolutely totally agree with you, because, you know, I'm very skeptical about indigenous movements, you know, when they talk about decolonization and whether it actually includes us in that movement. Yeah. So thank you very much for that, Ngahuia, you know, and your comments.
I wonder if we could close our Talanoa by looking at the intertwinements of drag and camp, which you write about, Patrick, and then Ioana, you might have some reflections, and then Yuki, if we could return to the whole idea of camping paradise.
Ioana, maybe you can begin.
Sure. I mean, it's hard to follow up everything, because I think kind of embedded in everyone's sharing is this kind of call for a future that is better. But I am struck listening to everyone about this kind of duality between recovering evidence on the one hand and the license to speculate or have or to kind of address the absences and histories in the other. Am I allowed to ask a question, Natalie? It's maybe a little bit broad, but I was just kind of curious, because everyone here is engaged, I think, in the project of history in some way, or in history's project in some way. And we've, you know, the problems of the records being partial, or fortunately, and as you were kind of saying, Ngahuia, kind of quite well established. I was just kind of curious as to what the role of fiction or speculation or artistic license is when it comes to writing arts histories and Indigenous histories and queer histories. That's quite a broad question, so I'm sorry. But I'm just conscious as well that everyone writes across quite different registers, even within their own practice, from poetry and essays, and I think creative fiction in your case as well, Ngahuia. So if it's okay, just to ask of the role of the speculative or the imaginative within an engagement with history. Sorry, that's less concluding than it is opening up, isn't it?
May I say something? I actually think, Ioana, that is a really big one, and that it should be addressed in another conversation. What I want to say, though, about Dragon Camp, bringing it back to the question asked by Natalie, is that, and I really want to say this, and I don't know Samoa. You know, I don't know Samoa of the 19th century and the 18th century, but I do know Māori. And we did not have male dress and female dress. We didn't. We all wore the same gear. However, our tattoo tradition was gendered. But even then, we know that a number of women, more and more women, also wore the male designs. It was wonderful to hear the story about hair, because we had that happen to us as well. Māori women had short hair, men had long hair. And in the early accounts, the grandeur and glamour of Māori fashion was really quite extravagant and recorded very, very meticulously by people like Banks and Cook and Solander and Parkinson. This is in the 1760s. And it's like there was no, chiefly women wore the same gear as chiefly men. Working people wore the same stuff in the plantations, whether they were male or female. The sexing of garments is very Victorian. So that's enough from me. Kia ora.
Yuki, perhaps we should finish with you and the whole idea of drag and camp and camping paradise and creating a whawhawhine utopia at the Venice Biennale in exhibition and in publication.
Patrick, would you like to add to that, or shall I just go ahead and add?
Just a quick one before you conclude, Yuki. I'm sure your conclusion will be fabulous. It's the idea of queerness and speculation, I think, can be constellated. So thank you, Ioana, for that proposition. And I think the relationship can be curatorially performed. And we see that in the pavilion, which has many parts, right? We have the archive, we have the publication, and of course the exhibition of objects, photographs, and so on and so forth. So I was also trying to do that in the Taiwan pavilion, in the sense that I wanted to offer something that is not part of this decolonial theory, because I'm not really a fan of it, and I'm a bit skeptical of how it has unfolded. So I am struck by a writer who formulated this idea of the trans-indigenous, and I think that is an interesting trajectory. Trans-indigenous, it brings together the indigenous and also the queer through the trans, but the trans here is contemplated as something that goes beyond. No? But I'm trying to inflect it with the queer. So I think we can do something with this term, the trans-indigenous as some kind of a foil to the buzzword that is decolonial. Yeah. So Yuki, please.
Oh, geez, I don't know how to follow up from that, but Patrick, thank you very much. I think it's very clear that without saying, but I have to say it, that Paradise Camp is queer by default without having to stipulate it. And then for that, I'm very grateful for Natalie in helping to realize that vision, and you got it, and then you get it, and then you're able to convey that, in the book, which I'm really grateful for, and to also embellish the publication, with the fonts, they were inspired by the late, Samoan font designer, Joseph Churchwood, and then, these patterns here you see on my screen, inspired by the patterns of the late Siapo artist, Sylvia Hanipale. And then, to actually make the publication to be really Samoan, or to at least come across, have an essence of Samoa in the publication. And for that, I'm really grateful for Natalie and Thames Hudson for able to, achieve, this publication. So with regards to Camping Paradise, well, the idea of paradise, of how Fa'afafine sees it and how the world sees it are two different things. Because how the world sees paradise, is these, it's an island that's basically not drowning, that is hospitable to tourists. And we're always there around the corner ready to serve cocktails. And then if we're lucky, we're going to get tips. But for the paradise for the Fa'afafine community, well, I guess I can speak for myself and some of my friends in the Fa'afafine community, is that we would like to live in paradise in a world where, colonial heteronormativity is shattered to make way for indigenous ways of understanding gender and sexuality, not necessarily through the binary lens, but maybe perhaps look at it through the indigenous lens, where, gender and sexuality is like a circle pie chart with different shades of gray. And then where, within that shades of gray also involves our interaction, with nature. Because, we always have to live in part with nature. We're so dependent on it. And, if we look beneath the ocean, we have many Fa'afafine species that are underwater, that are constantly changing their sex. So if we can see those kinds of things in nature, then why can't we see it in humankind? And then, so for that, I would just like to say world peace. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking time during your busy schedule and coming together for this first of 3 online Talanoa Forum. Whaawhetai tere lava to all our speakers, together with our digital masters as our partner, and the Tautai Pacific Arts Trust for facilitating this online Talanoa Forum series. For more information on Talanoa Forum's online and in-person programs presented in Venice, Leiden, and Amsterdam, please visit talanoaforum.ws.